Hello, my name is Kalista Wilson. I'm the president of the International Law Society here at the UNM School of Law. This is a recording of a teach-in panel hosted at the law school 1 week after the invasion of Ukraine. On the screen now is a list of our panelists. When speaking with Professor Jennifer Moore about the concept of this teach-in, we shared how, when there is a crisis throughout the world, it is easy to feel like we are not doing enough. But at the end of the day, we are professors and students, and at the very least, we can teach and we can learn. Due to my own error, I failed to record the first few minutes of the panel. However, I feel this recording would be lacking if you as the viewer were unable to hear the words read at the beginning of the panel. These are the words of my sorority sister, Lisa Vechehova, who is Ukrainian and has spent a significant part of her life in Ukraine. While I read her words, please enjoy some images of gorgeous Ukrainian culture. Since last Wednesday night, the most reoccurring thoughts have been as follows. Why is the world so shocked about the intensity and speed that Russia is attacking Ukraine with? The world didn't help Ukraine when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. There was little to no international interference that would pose a real threat to Russia. At the time, Ukraine had no military and nothing to fight back with. Giving Ukraine 8 years to prepare was Russia's biggest mistake. History repeats itself. The words "never again" don't mean anything if no preventative action is taken. The signs were all there, and yet my innocent Ukrainian brothers and sisters are dying on the streets from missiles. Kharkiv, currently the epicenter of war, is home to many of my aunts, uncles, and cousins. We still haven't been able to make contact with them. Since we're far past taking preventative action, I'd also like to point out that a pacifist stance in a cold blood war has never stopped aggressors from murdering. Unfortunately, if you want to win the game, you have to play it to the aggressor's caliber. Putin isn't going to be deterred by sanctions. He had 8 years to prepare for this war, and he won't stop until he has Ukraine. Ukrainians are built on centuries of Russian aggression. We deal with the darkness of the world by using humor and by returning to our communities for a cup of tea. We sit and talk and laugh and listen for hours. My people are generous. My people are kind. My people are badass. As I write this, my cousin has to decide whether he will leave his newborn baby, 2 older kids, and his wife to fight with the civilian army. My best friend is comforting refugees from the war-torn East with whatever food and clothes are available. Ukrainians are survivors. Just because you don't know the centuries-old history between Russia and Ukraine doesn't mean it doesn't exist. From 1932 to 1933, Russia created an artificial famine in Ukraine that killed 3.5 million Ukrainians. Has Russia ever acknowledged this genocide or been reprimanded? No. The world is sending thoughts and prayers, but I ask you to do more. Google what Ukraine looked like before the war. Watch its films, listen to its modern and traditional music. Go digging for artists and poets. Read about Ukraine's history, just not the narrative that Russia tries to push forward. Notice and acknowledge Ukrainians in your life. I want you to try and understand the beauty. I want you to try and understand why Ukrainians love Ukraine so much they'd take to the streets with Molotov cocktails and rifles. Make an effort to understand that what Ukrainians are fighting for can't possibly be quantified.
Became part of the Russian Empire during that time. In the 18th century, Ukraine is still part of the Russian Empire and actually enjoying relatively large autonomy under the rule of the Tsars. Fast forward to the beginning of the 20th century, with all the turmoil and craziness going on. So in 1917, when the Bolsheviks are coming to power, there were 2 attempts for the creation of independent Ukrainian republic. One of them was created in Kiev, and it actually existed for 3 or 4 years. It was called Ukrainian People's Republic, which was defeated by the Bolsheviks. And then later on, when the Soviet Union was created in 1922, Ukraine became part of it, as we all know, under the name of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Okay, next one. All right, so the question about Ukrainian identity and language is really interesting, and we have to really take into consideration all those historical changes, invasions, coexistence of several tribes in the course of history. So in simple terms, the Russian and Ukrainian identity has been formed by all those periods of changes in the borders in that part of the world, and the belonging to different states, the Polish, Lithuanian, the Mongols, the Russian Empire. The Ukrainian self-identity started to develop more obviously in the second half of the 17th century, and that process was complete around the 19th century. Of course, you understand we cannot draw very, very sharp boundaries here, but more or less this is what's going on. As far as the language goes, until 13th, 14th century, the written language of all the Slavs in Europe was Church Slavonic. So if you can picture Latin in the Middle Ages and the prestige that Latin enjoyed back then in Western Europe, you can picture Church Slavonic, but this was the written language of the Slavs. They did not speak that language. So at certain point, starting probably 17th, 18th century, the different Slavs, the different Slavic groups started developing their own Slavic languages, which had already different phonological, morphological, lexical peculiarities to lead to the present day Slavic languages that I will show you at the very end of the slide. So this resembles a lot the situation with Latin in medieval Europe and the emergence of Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, around 8th, 9th, 10th century. Those are the languages that people actually spoke on the street. They wrote in Latin, but they spoke those languages. The next one, please. Okay, so this is the very first Slavic alphabet. This is not the Cyrillic alphabet. A lot of people think the very first alphabet the Russians used was the Cyrillic. It's not. It's called the Glagolitic alphabet. It was created in 1862 by 2 Greek brothers, Saint Cyril and Methodius, who were sent from the Byzantine Empire to the Kingdom of Moravia to create specifically an alphabet specifically for the Slavic people. And then this particular alphabet later on gave way to the Cyrillic alphabet. Next slide, please. Okay, so those are the contemporary Russian and Ukrainian alphabets. And I put them side to side so you can see how similar they are. There are only 3 letters that are different in the Ukrainian alphabet. There's a particular E that is different phonologically due to the processes in the history of the languages, but everything else is the same here in between Russian and Ukrainian alphabet. Next one, please. All right, and finally, something called, this is the post-Soviet processes. After 1991, Ukraine became independent, and the so-called de-Russification processes started going on in Ukraine, mostly in the eastern part around Kharkiv and the Donbas area. So Ukrainian was proclaimed as the only state and official language of Ukraine, not Russian, and it became a silent marker of their national identification and independent Ukraine, and I'm quoting this here in an article. Russian remained a minority language, but with a very high informal status, which was used in everyday life. quite a lot, sometimes even more than Ukrainian. So some scholars think it's a paradox that some Ukrainians claim Ukrainian as their native language, their mother tongue, but at the same time, they use Russian in their daily lives more. So here, if we want to be a little bit more scholarly, we should look at the two different concepts, language identity and language practices. And in Ukraine, those two things do not align. And finally, after 2017, more and more emphasis on Ukrainian being used in various social spheres in the country, especially in the broadcast and education. Next one. Okay, so this is the present day Europe with all the Slavic groups that have settled there. And you can see clearly the three branches of the Slavic languages, West, East, and South. I'm not gonna spend time on that, but if you have more questions after that, I can answer them. And the next slide. And I just wanted to take a few seconds to honor the fallen civilians, Ukrainians, and Russians this past week.
And then next, we're gonna welcome Dr. Ivanova-Sullivan's student who is minoring in Russian and doing his major in nuclear engineering.
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Hamil, and as mentioned, I'm a third-year nuclear engineering student here at the University of New Mexico. I'm second majoring in Russian, and I recently completed a minor in mathematics. And as mentioned in the title slide, I was lucky enough to get the chance to visit the Russian Federation back in 2018. And I visited on vacation with my family. I love seeing the Hermitage and the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood, but the highlight for me was surprising the locals by speaking them with Russian as I began teaching myself in 2017. I'm very passionate about nuclear power and Russian history, so the current crisis in Ukraine is of great importance to me. But the history is the most important thing to note when looking into the nuclear side of this conflict. When the Soviet Union dissolved in the 1990s, Russia offered a security guarantee in exchange for the extraction of Soviet nuclear weapons into the newly formed Russian Federation. And as this map shows on the screen, Ukraine has 4 active nuclear power plants, but that number increases to 5 if you include Chernobyl. The 4th reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is currently entombed within a several billion-dollar sarcophagus for protection of the environment and for the eventual disassembly of all parts and treatment of waste within the facility. I'm sure that everyone has seen the news about the Russian army invading from Belarus and taking the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And it is true that radiation levels within the area have increased. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry, Justin.
It's okay. Yeah, so I was saying that I'm sure everyone has seen the news about the Russian army invading from the north, and the radiation levels have increased, but this is only because heavy military vehicles have moved through the area and are disturbing the ground, causing radioactive dust to get dispersed into the air. But the International Atomic Energy Agency said that this is nothing to worry about. However, there is something to worry about that does not have to do with radiation. And the reason I bring this up is because I've spoken with Carl Willis, who teaches several nuclear engineering classes here at the University of New Mexico. He has been to Chernobyl 8 times and has many contacts within Ukraine. And he has told me that the Russian army has taken around 100 civilian hostages at the power plant. These high-skilled workers are civilians being exploited by the Russians as they are deep behind Russian lines. This is a war crime. I naturally wanted to help these people, and I did not know what to do. And Carl Willis had mentioned to me that the American Nuclear Society is currently doing a fundraiser to help support Ukraine's nuclear workers and their families that are being impacted by the war. And I'm lucky enough to be actively involved in a position of leadership in the local chapter of the American Nuclear Society here at the University of New Mexico. So I encourage you to get involved and help in any way possible if you feel so called. Thank you.
And for those of you joining us on Zoom, we'll now welcome Professor Jennifer Moore.
I'm Jenny Moore. I know most of you. Thank you so much for being here. this is a teach-in and teach-ins, and I'm reserving my 5 minutes until I finish my welcome remarks. I will just note to Agent Wilson. A teach-in is meant to be a revolutionary, nonviolent revolutionary movement by students. At UNM Law School, often the professors take over the role of the students, which is fine, but we're not quite as revolutionary as you are. And so I am so grateful to Callie Wilson and to other members of the International Law Society and other student organizations and other students, and also to Cheryl Burbank and also to Tony Anderson and many others and my fellow panelists for making this a student-centered teaching, because teach-ins are about speaking and listening. They're about teaching and about learning. And in a situation of violence on so many levels, we have to listen because the situation is dynamic and ever-changing. And so even if we have great wisdom, we have to grow in our wisdom. So I am very grateful to be here. Now, I'm still reserving my 5 minutes. I'm reading a statement by my colleague, our colleague, Professor Gabe Pasiniak on our UNM faculty. And I'm just reading a statement that he has sent me. And I can't stand back.
No, because on Zoom, they can't hear you.
Okay, I'll stand here. This is Gabe Pasiniak. Thank you to all of those who have organized this forum for our community and who are sharing their perspectives today. I'm sorry that I'm not able to join. Unfortunately, I had a conflict that I couldn't move. As someone whose family is Polish with some ties to Western Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine is extremely distressing to me, especially because of all the conflict and tragedy this region has already seen. People living in Ukraine have experienced in the past century an intentional genocidal famine in the 1920s, pogroms, including by the Polish government, the Nazi occupation and Holocaust, including the murder of over 35,000 Jews and over 100,000 Ukrainians, to just name some of the most egregious examples. As I look at the current crisis, Professor Pasiniak writes, I can only hope that it ends quickly and recommits us all to work towards an international legal system that is more effective at preventing all wars and promoting peace, including in Ukraine, but in all the other places where conflict is taking place. And thank you to Professor Pasiniak for sharing those views with us. So my 5 minutes can start now. I teach international law and human rights, as you all know. And I approach the issues of war and peace as a former humanitarian worker with the UN High Commission on Refugees. Thank you, Josh. And as a granddaughter of a Quaker pacifist, my grandmother, Adeline Nicholas Moore, who was an extremely active pacifist. As one of my students urged me to say, pacifism must be active if we are pacifists. We must be engaged in nonviolence actively. So I have 5 minutes and I want to talk to you about the charter, the UN Charter, 1945, and the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which concern humane conduct in war, and the 1977 protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which also up the ante on the requirements for the humane treatment of civilians. However, and Josh, if you get tired, you can put it down because it's going to be 5 minutes. Okay. All right. So I have to spend 30 seconds at least on history, not going back as far as Dr. Ivanova-Sullivan did, but a bit of history, at least back into the 20th century. Putin, president of Russia, has declared that he had to invade disputed territories in eastern Ukraine and move to take Kiev to denazify the Ukrainian government. History teaches, however, that left-wing autocrats tend to blame their sins on fascists, just as right-wing autocrats tend to blame their sins on communists. These are words that are thrown around to demonize others and to justify the worst abuses of power. It's an old story, and it needs to be called out as a lie. We are asked to stand up for the UN Charter against Putin's aggression, and we should. But we must be mindful of our histories and our herstories. We are asked to compare Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 with Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939, and we should. But I suggest we remember two other historical and hysterical moments of 1991 and 2003. As Putin claims that Ukraine is historically a part of Russia, let us remember that Saddam Hussein in 1991, before invading Kuwait, claimed that Kuwait was a part of Iraq. As Putin claims he is fighting aggression against Russian nationalists in Ukraine, Hussein claimed he was fighting aggression against Iraqi loyalists in Kuwait. They made the same tortured claims of the defense of national interest and permission to intervene. And as Putin claims self-defense of the Russian sphere of influence against NATO aggression, let us remember that George W. Bush claimed anticipatory self-defense of US national interest against terrorism on the faith of falsified evidence of links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. So now we turn to what international law has to say. And this is all rules regarding the conduct of war and the decision to go to war. Very, very important. If you see the blue thing going around, it's excerpts from the UN Charter. Very, very important. Then we have the Geneva Conventions. And I'm going to copy and the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their 1977 protocols are also extremely important. But we cannot look at the law of war and the law of peace, the law of the going to war and the law of how we conduct ourselves in war without thinking about human rights, without thinking about human dignity, human agency, human integrity, and human well-being. So we have to think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. We have to think about the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have to think about the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People from 2007. We have to think about the Convention Against Torture. We have to think about the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. All treaties that the US has ratified and Russia has ratified. We have to think about human rights when we think about war. So just briefly, and how many moments do I have left? 15 seconds? Okay, so very, very briefly, if you want to know two things from the Charter, you know Article 2.4, the prohibition against the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. And Article 51, the customary norm codified of self-defense against an armed attack on the territory. If Russia wants to claim self-defense, it has to be responding to an armed attack against Russia. okay? In terms of the conduct of war, whether it's an aggressive war or a non-aggressive war, we know from ancient times that the law of war applies to all wars. Just because it's a just or legal war, according to some, civilians may not be attacked, wounded combatants may not be attacked, prisoners of war may not be treated inhumanely. But most importantly, targeted or indiscriminate attacks against civilians are prohibited by Protocol 1 to the 49 Geneva Conventions, also Article 51 of Protocol 1. Russia was ratified this first protocol and 4 years ago de-ratified it. But according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, this article is part of customary law. The notion of distinction, humanity, necessity, and proportionality are customary norms that apply regardless of who has signed or ratified what treaty. And I'm just gonna, this is student time. I'm now going to remind us with the preamble. Thank you, Professor Kastenberg, with the preamble to the UN Charter. Now, does anyone want to tell me why we care about a preamble when we're reading and understanding a treaty? Does anyone want to? Hannah, and then Kay. Hannah.
So the preamble helps us figure out the object and purpose of the treaty.
Beautiful. So when we're interpreting no use of force against territorial integrity or political independence, we remember the preamble. When we're interpreting the right of self-defense against armed attack, we're remembering the preamble. Kay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just that it's an interpretive tool. So if you're going to read an international treaty and you want to know what the writers were thinking and what their purposes were, you look to the preamble, and that tells you how to read the rest of the document.
International law, human rights too. Thank you very much. We did not rehearse. Warnings and hints were given only. Okay? So when we read Article 2.4 and Article 51 of the UN Charter, we remember the preamble. Does everyone have their preamble in hand? Okay. Aaron, do you have yours? Okay. I'm going to read the first part, and then Aaron's going to read the second part, and Hannah's going to read the third part. Oh, no. Aaron's going to read the first part. Who knows who's going to do what? We'll just point and say. I think actually, Aaron, you're going to read the first part. Loud.
Even people of the United Nations determined to save generations from the sun. Twice in their lifetime have brought untold sorrow to mankind.
Isadora.
Reaffirm faith in fundamental rights and the dignity and worth of the human person and the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for treaty obligations and other sources of international law can be maintained.
Josh, do you have yours? No.
For these areas, scholars live together and teach one another that is the only that unite our country and that first of all in methods that are allowed to use state and economic and economic and social advancement of all.
Thank you all.
Hello? Is it working? Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Hi, everybody. So I'm Russian. I was born in Russia. I'm a Russian citizen. My family are still in Russia. So I'm on that, I guess, on that side of the conflict. Anyway, I would like to talk about how this war started and a bit about how Putin interpreted the speech, how Russians see the conflict. So this all happened actually in 2014 because during the Sochi Winter Olympic Games, there was a revolution in Ukraine where the leader of Ukraine, Yanukovych. His name is Yanukovych, who was a Russian like stooge. Basically, he was a Russian crony. He was pro-Russian, pro-Putin, very corrupt. He was overthrown by the Ukrainian people, and afterwards, right afterwards, Putin went and invaded Crimea as a result of that. He couldn't, because it was during the Winter Olympics Games, he couldn't interfere while the revolution was happening. But right afterwards, because he realized that he lost his closest ally, Ukraine, and pro-Western forces were going to come in. He went and invaded Crimea. And the thing is, Russians for the longest time, they view Crimea as their own territory, because Russia actually won Crimea from the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. Then afterwards, in the 20th century, during the time of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, who was Ukrainian actually, he gifted Crimea to the Socialist Republic of Ukraine. And by that time, because they were all within the Soviet Union, it didn't really matter. But then when the Soviet Union collapsed, Crimea suddenly became not Russian, but Ukrainian. Afterwards, so when Putin took Crimea from Ukraine and invaded and annexed it, it was actually an insanely popular decision in Russia. His approval ratings went down massively, and like vast majority of Russians supported that invasion. And then afterwards, an argument started to appear in the Russian press from the 8 years until this war, that the eastern half of Ukraine, the predominantly ethnically Russian half, does not belong to Ukraine either. Is that apparently it was given to Ukraine right after the Bolshevik Revolution by the Bolsheviks, because the Ukrainians were not considered to be sufficiently supportive of communism. So they decided to add some add some ethnic Russians to Ukraine. That's the argument. So then they added the separatist republics of Donbass, and then afterwards, that was the argument for a long time. So when Putin gave his speech last Monday, I expected for him to fully make that argument that he was going to go and invade and take over those territories because he did not consider them to be Ukrainian anyway, But what was kind of terrifying is the fact that when I heard him speak, he didn't mention that. He kind of mentioned those territories, but he started attacking the existence of the Ukrainian state totally. Like he started to say, well, he made a speech saying that Ukraine was never a country. It was just an invention of the Bolsheviks. Is that the Ukrainians were always part of Russia. And then he used the historical, analogies and bring back to the way to the Kievan Rus, explaining that. And for me, it was very different that he spent 90% of his speech talking about that. He kind of briefly mentioned NATO and how how America and the West broke its promise to Russia about not expanding NATO. But throughout majority of the speech, he focused specifically on the fact that he did not think Ukraine should be its own territory. Basically, that he should take it back, but also another important dimension is that because of the Russian language stuff and the Ukrainian language is actually a very important issue in Russia, because Russia kind of views when Ukraine went and made Ukrainian like the official state language, like in 2017, that's actually kind of used as an act of aggression by Russia. It's kind of used as an attack on its citizens. So that is one of the reasons why a lot of Putin uses as a way to attack Ukraine. It's because he's arguing that he's protecting the Ukrainians who are living in Ukraine because the Russians who are living in Ukraine because they only speak Russian and now they're forced to speak Ukrainian and they don't know how to speak Ukrainian. But anyway, that's what his argument is about, and like that. And he argues currently that the people who are in charge of Ukraine are fascists because in Russia there's this belief in Russia that, and I mean there is some historical evidence to this, that right after the Stalin caused the famine in Ukraine in the 1930s, when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, some Ukrainians went and joined the Nazis against Russia. And that element of Ukrainian history has never been forgiven by Russia. And that Russia views it as like very negatively. As a result, this is part of the reason why Russia accuses Ukrainians of being Nazis right now, because it all goes all the way back 18th century. Like I talked to my grandfather, 2 days ago, and he is supportive of this war because he says, well, 80 years ago there were Nazis in Ukraine. There were Ukrainians who joined who fought for Nazi Germany, and so we need to finish the process of denazification of Ukraine. That is basically kind of the propaganda that's being currently fed to the Russian people, unfortunately. But that is how kind of the Russian President Putin views it, because he doesn't really view because he does not view it as clearly like I would say logically, but it's very he views it very emotionally, very nationalistically as a result of that. But yeah. Right. Do you have enough time?
And I just wanted to be cognizant that we have students who will have class in 15 minutes. And I know we do have 3 more panel speakers, and since Professor Moore kindly used enough of her time, she is going to happily give over some of her international law class time at 1 o'clock. So I do want to pause from our speakers for a moment. I'm grateful that we were able to hear from some student voices, but I wanted to continue that and take a couple questions. And just remind everyone that we're joined by Professor Kastenberg, who has a background in U.S. national security law, as well as Professor Gonzalez, who was planning on sharing information with us about imperialism and the fascism-communism dichotomy. And finally, we have Professor Figueroa, who spent time with U.S. aid in Ukraine in 2012. So bear in mind, we do have those experts as you ask questions. I understand that there are some challenges with the audio on Zoom. I apologize. We are working with what we got. So if there are any students in the audience that have a question, I would love to take that now. And then we'll hear from some more of our panelists. Really? Yes, Dean Romero.
Forces there, we want to send our young soldiers there. And my question is, what can you do? Maybe Professor Kastenberg can answer this question. It seems to me that Russia has used cyber attacks by people in this information. Why can't the U.S. use cyber attacks to disable a lot of the hack into the military of Russia? Ukraine has a lot of technical cyber experts. Can they fight Russia by disabling a lot of their infrastructure, technical infrastructure? Because I'm just really concerned that this has got to stop.
So for folks on Zoom, Dean Romero just asked that there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of sanctions and different things that are flying around the world, but what are some concrete actions we can take, specifically focusing on the fact that there have been cyber attacks, and is there any countermeasures? And I would welcome up Professor Kastenberg if you wanted to speak on that.
I'm gonna defer on that because I'm gonna talk about that if I get an opportunity to do so, Professor Romero. But it's a great question, but just hold on that. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Is there any other student question in the meantime? If not, we'll welcome up Professor Kastenberg.
You want to?
Yes, Professor Figueroa.
Figueroa, would you like to go next?
Yes.
You come on
I thought
up.
you were going on the order here.
We're just going with it at this point. Will you speak nice and loudly? Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so happy that there is great interest here. I'm Professor Figueroa. I am not Russian. I'm not Ukrainian, but I spent a little bit of time in Ukraine as part of the U.S. Foreign Assistance diplomatic body in Ukraine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to offer a couple of different perspectives. One on the argument that Russia is making for this invasion, this attack, and how they're trying to control the narrative, and also my impressions in Ukraine when I was there. So, and maybe I'll start with where Professor Moore started with the UN Charter, right? So about the UN Charter, Russia has built a narrative, and the narrative is like, wait a minute, the US hasn't followed the UN rules of war when it comes to Iraq. Why are they holding us to this standard, right? And I'm not saying that I agree with that narrative, but that's a narrative that is being presented in Russia at the moment. Another narrative is that, wait a minute, the US has a sphere of influence in Latin America, where we spend millions of dollars in foreign assistance, and I've been there, funded by that money. And countries, for the most part, respect each other's sphere of influence. And Ukraine is within Russia's sphere of influence. Again, I'm not saying that I advocate for or believe these narratives, but these are narratives that are being presented in Russia, right? Finally, there is a lot of disinformation in Russia. It's hard to believe, but we also have to accept the fact that that Putin has a lot of support within Russia. And there are different reasons for that, but some Russians do support him in general. They don't specifically support the war. But after the Crimea invasion, his popularity increased. And I don't know what's going to happen now, but that's something we have to come to terms with. He's not this rogue, unliked dictator in Russia. He's got some support. Now, let me now tie it back to Ukraine. When I spent time in Ukraine, Russia's presence was everywhere. So you would go to the store, buy something, it was spoken in Russian, to the ballet, to take the train, it was all Russian. And in the diplomatic circles that I was in, whenever we met a Russian official, the question was asked, is he pro-Russian? Is he pro-Ukrainian? Or even worse, is he pro-West, but really a Russian spy? So these little games of jockeying for position were happening in Ukraine. And if maybe some of you don't know, that the US has spent a lot of money on soft power in Ukraine, pro-democracy programs, other programs. And it's funny, Russia has hated that because they see that as the West pushing Ukraine away from Russia. And Russia has responded likewise with their own influential programs trying to infiltrate the Ukrainian government in different levels. When I was in Ukraine, some people truly believed that they wanted to go back to the times of the old Soviet Union. And in fact, they would have probably been happy with being part of Russia. However, a lot of people, and I will end in a minute, a lot of people in Ukraine also were embracing the West. They wanted a reform of the democratic institutions, and they were starting to reclaim some of their Ukrainian identity by, for example, requiring that Ukrainian be taught in certain schools. My Ukrainian colleague spent money on a private school because she was told the curriculum was going to be in Ukrainian. So there was that initiative within Ukraine of some Ukrainians that, yeah, we're not Russia anymore. We want to become our own. Anyway, that's it for me. I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Professor Gonzalez.
Okay. Buenos tardes, good afternoon. My name is Marc-Tizoc Gonzalez. I'm happy to be here with you. I teach property ethics, wills and trusts, and some other courses here. My scholarship theorizes how constitutional jurisprudence, civil rights statutes, and property law affect people who are hungry, marginalized, impoverished, and otherwise the subjects of violence. My professional service includes a substantial period of time working with Black Crit, Latina and Latino critical legal theory, which is an outgrowth of critical race theory, legal feminism, third world approaches to international law, and other schools of thought, which attempt to investigate and illuminate the social and legal conditions that subordinate diverse peoples here in the United States and across the global South, in the aspiration to advance people's struggles against injustice and to help more people suffer less. Today, I ask you to contemplate the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine within the post-World War II context of post-fascism. Although this concept is infrequently used here in the United States, scholars of fascism, Nazism, and neo-fascism use this concept, post-fascism, to describe the post-World War II efforts to dismantle the legacies of Italian fascism and other little f fascist regimes. This term also describes purportedly new political parties like Italy's Alleanza Nazionale, which expressly disclaimed its big F fascist origins, yet nevertheless valorized Mussolini and other aspects of its own historical fascism, as it advanced its new, supposedly far-right, nationalist, nativist, and/or racist ideologies and policies. I'll note here also that when he was a candidate, Donald John Trump quoted Mussolini, and when people called him on it, he said, "It's a good quote. I like strong quotes." This concept of post-fascism was part of the theme for LACCRIT's 2019 biennial conference, which we organized under the title, "The Dispossessed Majority, Resisting the Second Redemption in America Post-Fascista in Post-Fascist America." And if today's comments interest you, you can read a little bit more about them in that symposium forward. In my view, the concept of post-fascism is useful because it names at least 3 historical periods and 1 aspiration. First, as suggested, the whole world arguably became post-fascist after World War II. While Italy had to deal directly with dismantling big F fascism and Germany with Nazism, peoples across the world had survived or not the cultural, political, social, and technological innovations of little f fascism. And this is basically the harnessing of mass enfranchisement and the politics that arise from that at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, combined with the effects at that time of industrialization and what you do to move masses of people successfully to your ends. Second, I believe that post-fascism is particularly useful in the Americas. America post-fascista also names the late 1980s to early 1990s period when various Latin American peoples began to dismantle the dictatorships and reclaim the democracies that had terrorized their peoples. And finally, I submit to you that the concept of post-fascism, and in particular a notion of America post-fascista, may be helpful to reframe our situation here in the United States after the 2000 judicial coup of Bush v. Gore, wherein the Rehnquist court ordered a halt to the ballot recount that the Supreme Court of Florida had ordered. In his 2001 article on the subject, Bush v. Gore and the Boundary Between Law and Politics, Yale law professor Jack Balkin noted, quote, "The possibility that a president might be installed by a coup, judicial or otherwise, does not appear to have been explicitly provided for in the Constitution." Balkin, of course, wrote that understated and terribly prescient statement 20 years before the January 6, 2021 insurrection and attempted coup at the Capitol. Finally, in my view, the notion of post-fascism might name a political aspiration that we might have. Can people here in the United States learn from the experience of peoples around the world in order to repudiate the autocratization, that is the decline in core institutional requirements for electoral democracy, which social scientists have shown began in 1994 and is expressed and manifest in the resurgence of authoritarianism, inverted totalitarianism, and post-fascism. Finally, as to the Russian Federation's invasion of the Ukraine, I believe that the concept of post-fascism can help disrupt outdated binaries like right versus left, communism versus fascism, and clarify that the principle, if you want to call it that, which unites seemingly disparate politicians like Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and too many others to name, is rooted within a masculinist lust for power, wealth, and violence. Thank you.
So I'm Josh Kastenberg, and I teach constitutional law and criminal procedure, and occasionally national security law. There's so many things that we could listen to each other about and talk about. I'm about to paint you what I believe is a pretty bleak picture. Some of you have ties to the military, and some of your classmates are either reservists or here as on a military scholarship. I'm thinking back about our graduates here, and there are 14 of them since I've been here in the JAG Corps, the various service branches. And I reflect on that, and I reflect on our commitment not to send forces forward, but things get out of hand. And when we think about analogies, we can go back to 1938 or 1939. I won't spend much time on this, but I'd like to take us back to the summer of 1914, when no major European leader really wanted to go to a national, worldwide war. But through a series of missteps that happened, it was the greatest disaster in at least European history up until that point, where millions died in World War I. What is national security law? What does national security mean to us? Well, it means how we protect ourselves, our allies, and our values, knowing that our own history may be flawed. You've heard of that today. Present policies may have inequities to them, but they're often, democracy is often laden with hope. Here's the sight picture, though, of where we're at. The war's expanded. It already expanded because the EU is fat. And I'm about to say this, I don't oppose any of it, but the EU fast-tracked Ukraine into its ambit. That's an economic relationship, but it means that NATO can be bypassed to supply armed forces. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Germany, France, not England anymore, Britain, but to protect Ukraine. And maybe that should happen. Here's what a future war looks like. And before I think possibilities, before I make a comment on that, I spent over 2 years of my life in Iraq. It doesn't make me special, but I grew up with a father who was a veteran of Vietnam, 2 grandfathers who were veterans of World War II. I've seen the effects of war on a family. My own kids could probably, if they talk behind my back, tell you what the effects of war are on this family, or they could tell me too. You know, they're pretty honest. They're teenagers. They'll say what's ever on their mind. I've lost friends. Okay, I get it. Here's the future. This war cannot remain localized in Ukraine if it expands, and this is what I mean by it. Suppose tomorrow the sanctions are really working, and they are, Putin decides, I'm going to detonate a tactical nuclear weapon over the Black Sea, which he might do. He's not going to target people. But that gets us closer to the brink than we've ever been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why would he do that? Because he's desperate and he wants the sanctions off. What would the United States reaction be if we actually went into armed conflict because of a misstep? The thing we fear the most isn't a cyber attack on the DoD. We're pretty well protected. Now, McDonald's, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they're not. Disney, air traffic control system. This is what we fear most. Russia's SSBN fleets. We would expand the war because we would hit every major Russian port to keep their submarines from sailing. You can't keep a war local in Ukraine because if you're going to do an air campaign, you have to do an air interdiction campaign. And that means you bomb Russian targets as they're trying to get into the Ukraine. You can't keep a ground war in Ukraine because Russia's ally, Belarus, has been rather not silent in the last 5 years and claiming areas of Poland belong to them. So the war spills out into Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. By the way, Putin's goal isn't just Ukraine. It's a corridor to the Baltic. Look at what happened. If you're living in Israel right now, what you're reading is that when the Israelis signed the condemnation of Putin, the Russian response to Israel was, you go leave the Golan Heights. Watch for Russian flyovers over Golan. The Israelis will shoot them down. Nobody can control the Israelis. Their defense posture is shoot. Shoot, 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 and then ask a question. That's a diversionary conflict. I'd worry a lot more about that one spilling over than I would about China and Taiwan. In fact, the least possible thing right now, it's not impossible, is China trying to take Taiwan. Because that immediately goes from a local conflict to a regional one. And all the while, what Putin is gambling on is that we'll go no further. But what does that mean to the Ukrainians? So the Russian army sent 4 of their frontline divisions into Ukraine. They've been bogged down. The Russian army is composed of 2 different basic kinds of troops. They're professionals and they're conscripts. Now they're sending in their conscripts. But they did targeting through cruise missiles and direct attacks, and that failed. They're now bringing in their heavy artillery. What does that mean? That means they're going to try to level Kiev, Kharkov, and the other cities. They're going to kill thousands of people in a manner that we haven't seen since World War II. If this war doesn't end now, that is the bleakest picture that I can draw. But it's bleak, it's also real. Because if you went to bed one night in 1962 and you heard a John F. Kennedy speech about blockading Cuba, you probably know the position we're in right now. Now, as for Professor Romero's question about cyber war, there's 2 reasons we might not do it. One is we wouldn't really want to show the world what we have. By the way, since I've been out of the military now for 6 years, I can only imagine what we have. I would, whatever it was 6 years ago, it's that plus steroids now. But the other reason is there's an argument in international law that sanctions are not an act of war, but a cyber attack certainly is an act of war. I'm not opposed to what we did to Iran with Stuxnet and shut their reactor down, but that's an act of war. That's no different than the Israelis bombing the Iraqi nuclear power plant at Ozark, a generation earlier. It's considered to be a kinetic analogy. How does the law govern in this? That's the $1 million question, because we haven't been in this position in a long, long time. And the character of warfare has changed dramatically, from information as an instrument of war, social media as an instrument of war, disrupting communications as an instrument of war. These are all complex times. But the way ahead is very frightening and very dangerous, whatever path we take. So I understand why Biden spoke the way he spoke last night. I think that's threading the needle fairly well. We're not going to commit troops. That's actually telling the Russians, get out, but we're not planning on expanding if you do. So I think I'm out of time.
There it is.
I just want to thank everyone for coming. I'm going to give folks a couple minutes to leave if they need to leave because I know we're into the next class block. But I do want to give the opportunity for one or two student questions are preferred from our in-person audience here, if anybody has them. Come on, you're law students, or be shy.
Extra credit in any class, 1 point for any prof or read. If you can send your prof who said these 3 quotes. Take codeine and not speak. No Googling. No Googling.
For the professors in the room, surprise, Professor Moore just gave everyone 1 point on your final exam of extra credit. Are there any? Yes, hi.
Okay, I'm not a law student.
That's okay. We'll welcome your question.
But one aspect of what's going on that has really disturbed me, and I just was wondering, if somebody could comment on it, and maybe I'll just come late, so maybe this is that in terms of the reading, obviously there's been some issues of African and Indian students who have faced less than fair treatment, who have been, in this case, it's like in a way life and death, where they were trying to board buses and trains, and they were told they were just the Ukrainians, initially welcome for women and children, and then when they're trying to have women and children, and then they're also turned back. And I heard it in a way from 2 angles. One is that it's only the Ukrainians doing this, and it's been treated well when they've gotten to Poland, or those who have. And the other is that when they got to Poland, they were told, oh, you should go to Romania or to another country. And I see this just in terms of, and I don't buy the Russian charge that they're trying to denazify, but it just brings back memories of the Holocaust in a way, and which both Figueroa was just destroyed, by the way, which is I'm very fortunate that television that I have in this first place has YouTube. So I listen to Al Jazeera and Roku and CBC and Germany the other day. So anyway, with that,
Yeah, thank you. Let me.
And that is, I understand very recently, that both the president and this prime minister's vice president are
So for folks joining us on Zoom, the question centers around the fact that obviously in times of crises, there are refugees fleeing areas, and in the current conflict, one thing that there have been reports of is on the borders of Ukraine, as Ukrainians and people living within Ukraine flee the country, non-Ukrainian citizens, so folks from Africa, India, or throughout the world, are being stopped at the border and not permitted refugee access to Poland. I'm sure our panelists have something to say, but I want to remind folks that one of the principal norms that's upheld in international refugee law is the idea of non-refoulement, which means that if someone is fleeing a dangerous or violent nation, the country that is receiving them is expressly prohibited from returning them to a violent situation in which they could be harmed. And I see Professor Figueroa has something to add.
Yeah, just to mention the question, I think Ukrainian and Russian are still have a lot of racism, if I can just say it bluntly. And I've experienced it myself when I lived in Ukraine. I experienced it in Russia as well. So what's happening doesn't really surprise me, but there's a lot of racism in the US as well. Now, the question here that's come to light because when they're boarding the trains to escape, they're giving preference to Ukrainian citizens, and that's completely unfortunate. So
It's not since a lot of us in the room are legal scholars, and I'm sure Professor Moore has more to say on that. It's not only tragic and awful, it does go against a lot of well-found principles of international refugee law and human rights law. If you would like.
No, let's take another.
Is there another? Yes.
The gentleman talked about the nuclear reactors in Ukraine. It was also true that there were nuclear bombs in Ukraine. And America, Germany, and Russia, in order to get Ukraine to give up those bombs, which they had when the Soviet Union broke up, they made certain guarantees. This is legal. You two are the legal people here. They guaranteed certain things to Ukraine, which I don't believe are being done. But Ukraine gave up these nuclear weapons, and those guarantees have not been fulfilled as far as I can see.
Now that's correct. Much of the Soviet stockpile of their intercontinental ballistic missile systems were in Ukraine. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Ukrainian government took possession of them. And as part of Ukraine becoming an independent country, the former Soviet Union, Gorbachev and then Yeltsin signed into an agreement with the United States and Germany, guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty as long as they gave up those nuclear weapons. The fear wasn't Ukraine would use them, is that they would fall into the hands of third-party actors. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
No, so we would have some obligations.
We do.
Even
Yes.
now.
And I do see that we're over the 15-minute mark. Thank you, Professor Moore. But I want to take one last question before we finish up for the day from the back of the room.
Yeah, sure. Well, Professor, just kind of compromises that are acceptable to Ukraine and the Russians. But preempt that kind of program. Specifically an ethnic partition.
So for those of us on Zoom, the question was the rather bleak picture that Professor Kastenberg envisioned for us. Could there be any compromises? One suggestion was almost an ethnic partition of the country between eastern and western Ukraine.
There could have been prior to the invasion, but now you would be compromising on a partition based on massacres of innocent civilians and the Ukrainian people with a Russian refusal to do any sense of reparations or liability. I mean, imagine saying, okay, we'll do a partition, but Mr. Putin, you've got to stand trial. I don't see that happening. And frankly, that's a victory for Putin. And I don't see that happening either. So right now, a compromise, I don't know, maybe if the government of China and the government of India joined in and did something, you might, but absent that, I don't see it.
I have a
And
follow.
then Professor Moore is going to add.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate the idea of like, let's think about what could go right. But I would also say that partition has a bad history in the world. You know, if you think about the Indian subcontinent, think about India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, you think about Yugoslavia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo. You know, partition turns into partition. And if part of the problem here is ethnic identity being politicized, then I, would argue for some type of pan identity that was encouraging people to think collectively. Now that sounds so pie in the sky, but I think we have to think that way. We have to believe that's possible. And in terms of, getting out of this mess, the best things I've heard is the president of Ukraine saying, no preconditions, you got to stop bombing us, but we will talk about negotiating, changing our constitution, about saying we're going to become part of NATO. I mean, there might need to be some real compromise from some leaders here. not just the people. Because I think the people are doing the best they can, probably on both sides of the border, certainly within Ukraine. So anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that note, and I'll just conclude by adding to what Professor Moore said. I had the privilege of spending some time in Bosnia and Herzegovina a few years ago, and we viewed the scourges of the genocide that took place in Bosnia, specifically the massacre in Srebrenica. And that country is currently partitioned, and the Yugoslav broke up into a number of partitions, and ethnic tensions are just as high today in Bosnia as they were at the beginning of the genocide. And from my friends in Bosnia, there is concern that with the conflict in Ukraine, that could spill over into other post-Soviet countries like Bosnia. And so I think that as we try and move forward today, there are worst case scenarios and best case scenarios. And I think that we each have our own sphere of influence, and to make sure that you are helping people and supporting and learning the best you can within your own sphere of influence is the most we can do right now. And just for the folks still left in the room, I would again point you to the QR codes throughout the room. There's more information about Ukraine, more teaching tools, as well as organizations doing humanitarian relief work within the country. Always, if you want to support monetarily, the International Red Cross is never a bad place to start. And on that note, I'm going to conclude us for today. And I really thank everyone. And for those of us in the room, we had about 200 participants on Zoom. So this was a great turnout. And as the crisis calls for it, we will have more teach-ins if they're needed. And we'll spend more time for Q&As in the next one. But I really, really appreciate everyone coming today.
Thank you.